You're about to hear a story that doesn't just disturb you, it stays with you. Because in this case, the killer didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't even deny it. Instead, he picked up the phone, calmly dialed emergency services, and reported the crime himself. And what investigators would uncover next would leave even seasoned officers questioning what really happened inside that house. But before we get into this, I want you to do something quickly. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. I read every single one. And if you're into real, raw, true crime stories like this, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who won't see the ending coming, and subscribe so you never miss what's next. Because this story only gets darker from here. On a quiet April evening in a small Louisiana town, nothing seemed out of place. Families were home. Dinner was being prepared. Children were settling in for the night. And inside one house, a mother of 4 was doing something completely ordinary. Cooking. Eggs were left on the stove, still heating, still burning, because just a few steps away, inside the bathroom, she was already dead. The call came in like any other. Calm. Controlled. Almost too calm. A man's voice on the other end reported a crime, gave an address, and then hung up. No panic. No urgency. No explanation. Just silence. And that silence immediately raised alarms. Because people who are scared don't sound like that. An officer was dispatched immediately. What he was about to walk into, he had no way of preparing for. As he arrived at the home, something felt off before he even stepped inside. The door, the atmosphere, the stillness. And then he heard them. Children. 4 young girls were inside the house. Alone. Confused. And unknowingly standing just feet away from something no child should ever witness. The oldest daughter, trying to stay strong, approached the officer. And what she said next would send a chill down his spine. Her mother was in the bathroom. The eggs were burning. And something was very, very wrong. The officer moved quickly, guiding the children away, trying to shield them from whatever was waiting behind that door. Because in situations like this, seconds matter. But nothing could prepare him for what he was about to see. Inside the bathroom, their mother lay motionless. A single gunshot wound to the head. No movement. No response. Gone. The house was quiet. Too quiet. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken furniture. No chaos. Just stillness, which made the situation even more disturbing. Because scenes like this usually tell a story. But this one? It was almost like nothing had happened at all. And then came the first major question. Where was the caller? The man who reported the crime had vanished. No trace. No sign of forced entry. No indication anyone else had been inside. Except him. And yet, he was nowhere to be found. Officers immediately began clearing the house. Room by room. Corner by corner. Calling out. Listening. Waiting for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No second victim. No suspect. Just the echo of their own footsteps. And the weight of what had just happened. Meanwhile, outside the house, something incredible was happening. The oldest daughter, showing a level of courage far beyond her years, began leading her younger sisters to safety, step by step, holding them together, protecting them, doing everything she could to keep them from breaking down. A neighbor quickly stepped in, taking the children inside, away from the scene, away from the flashing lights, away from the reality that their lives had just changed forever. Back inside, officers continued their search, still trying to understand what they were looking at, still trying to piece together what didn't make sense, because something about this case wasn't adding up. At first glance, it almost looked like a possible self-inflicted wound. There were no immediate signs of forced violence, no obvious defensive injuries, nothing that clearly pointed to a struggle. But instinct told them otherwise, because something felt wrong. As they began identifying the victim, everything shifted. The name hit one of the officers immediately. He knew her, not just as a name, not just as a face, but personally. They had gone to school together, shared history, shared memories, And now, he was standing in her home, investigating her death. That changes everything, because now this isn't just a case. It's personal. Determined to find answers, the investigation quickly moved outside. Neighbors were questioned. Cameras were checked. Every possible detail was being pulled together. And that's when the first real lead appeared. A vehicle. A black truck. Seen leaving the house just minutes before the call was made. Now the situation had direction. Someone had been there. Someone had left. And someone knew exactly what happened. As officers went door to door, asking questions, one neighbor mentioned something critical. The victim had a significant other, someone she had been seeing, someone who had been at the house earlier that evening. And suddenly, a name entered the investigation. A man who, according to those close to her, had been causing tension. A man whose presence raised concerns. A man who might have been the last person to see her alive. But before officers could even begin searching for him, everything changed. Again, another call came in. This time, from the suspect himself. Calm. Controlled. Just like before. He told dispatchers exactly what he had done. He admitted to the shooting, and then gave them his location, sitting alone in a parking lot, waiting. No attempt to escape, no resistance, no hesitation, just waiting to be arrested. And that's when the case took a turn no one expected, because people who commit crimes like this don't usually act like that. As officers approached him, they were on high alert. Situations like this can flip in seconds. A calm suspect can turn dangerous instantly. But he didn't. He complied, sat down, allowed himself to be taken into custody without a fight. And even then, something felt off, because he wasn't acting like someone who had just taken a life. No panic, no breakdown, no visible remorse, just control. And that's when investigators began to realize this might not be a simple case of violence. This might be something far more calculated, because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the calmest. And as they began digging deeper into his story, what he said next would change everything. Because according to him, it wasn't murder, it was self-defense. And suddenly, the truth became a lot harder to find. Self-defense. That was the word he chose. The word that would either save him or expose him. Because once a suspect says self-defense, everything changes. Now investigators aren't just trying to prove what happened. They're trying to disprove his entire version of reality. Sitting inside the interrogation room, he appeared unusually composed. Not the kind of calm that comes from shock, but the kind that feels practiced, controlled, almost rehearsed. Detectives had seen this before. The quiet ones are often the hardest to read, because they don't give emotion away easily. And without emotion, lies become harder to detect. He began his statement slowly, carefully choosing words, explaining that there had been tension between him and the victim, a relationship that was falling apart, arguments that had escalated over time. And then came the turning point in his story. He claimed she had a firearm, that she had pulled it during an argument, that he feared for his life. That, in the struggle, it went off. But even as he spoke, something didn't align, because detectives noticed what he didn't say. No clear detail about panic, no vivid description of fear, no emotional breakdown when describing a woman he allegedly just killed. Just structure, almost like a prepared narrative. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation room, investigators were already working to verify his claims. The weapon, the scene, the forensic evidence, everything had to match his story, or collapse it completely. And what they found inside the home raised even more questions. There were no obvious signs of a violent struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no chaotic indicators that would normally accompany a fight over a firearm. Instead, the scene was still, too still, like something had happened quickly, almost quietly. And then came the gun, recovered during processing, the alleged murder weapon. But when they ran the serial number, something unexpected appeared. It wasn't registered to him. It was registered to her. the victim. That detail changed the entire direction of the investigation, because if the firearm belonged to her, then his self-defense claim suddenly gained weight, but only on the surface, because possession doesn't explain intent, and intent is what investigators needed to prove. Back inside the interrogation room, detectives pressed harder. They wanted clarity, specifics, consistency. When exactly did she pull the weapon? Where were they standing? Who was closest to the door? How long did the struggle last? But his answers began to blur. Details shifted slightly each time. Small inconsistencies. Subtle changes in sequence. Nothing obvious, but enough to raise concern. And then came something even more troubling. When asked about the children, his tone changed. Not emotionally, but strategically, like the topic was inconvenient. Something to move past quickly. Detectives noticed it immediately, because in cases like this, the presence of children is not a detail, it's a psychological anchor, and his lack of emotional reaction to them stood out. Meanwhile, outside pressure was building. Family members were being interviewed, neighbors were giving statements, and a pattern was forming. Almost everyone described tension, not just between the couple, but specifically involving him. Some called him unpredictable, others described him as controlling. A few even admitted they feared he might eventually snap, but fear is not evidence. And investigators knew that. They needed facts, not opinions. Then came surveillance footage. A black truck, seen leaving the area shortly before the emergency call. Time-stamped. Clear. Undeniable. It placed him at the scene, right around the time of death. But even that didn't fully solve the puzzle, because presence doesn't automatically equal guilt. And then something unexpected happened. A second 911 call. From him. This time, he wasn't reporting a crime. He was surrendering. He gave his exact location. A parking lot, sitting inside his vehicle, waiting to be arrested. No escape attempt. No chase. No resistance. Just waiting. And that behavior confused everyone, because guilty suspects usually run, or hide, or deny. But he had done none of those things. When officers arrived, they approached cautiously, expecting unpredictability, but he complied immediately. Hands visible, no aggression, no hesitation, almost cooperative. Inside his vehicle, investigators began searching. What they found added more complexity. Prescription medications, testosterone vials, syringes, not illegal items, but relevant, because substances like these can influence mood, aggression, and emotional regulation. Still, nothing directly linked him to intent. Nothing definitively proved premeditation, and that's where the case became dangerous for the prosecution, because without clear intent, self-defense becomes harder to disprove. But detectives weren't convinced. Not yet. Because they had seen enough cases like this to know one thing. A calm suspect doesn't always mean an innocent one. Sometimes, it means someone who already rehearsed the outcome. Back at the station, the interrogation continued. This time more intense, more focused, less patient. Detectives began confronting contradictions. The timeline, the behavior, the lack of visible struggle. The way he described events almost too neatly, and slowly, pressure began to build. His calmness started to crack, not dramatically, but subtly, in pauses, in hesitation, in repeated phrasing, and then came the most important shift. When detectives asked him to describe the victim, he didn't use her name. He referred to her as the woman. Never personal, never emotional, never familiar. To investigators, that detail mattered more than it seemed, because language reveals relationship, and emotional distance can be telling. But still, they didn't have enough. Not yet. Because in court, suspicion is not proof. And right now, everything still depended on one thing. Forensics. The autopsy. The timeline. The trajectory of the bullet. The exact sequence of events. Until those results came back, the truth remained suspended, somewhere between self-defense and something far darker. And what investigators didn't know yet was that the most important piece of evidence was still waiting to be revealed, right inside the very house where it all began. By the time the autopsy results came back, everything changed. Not slowly, not slightly, but completely. Because now investigators weren't dealing with assumptions anymore. They were dealing with facts. Cold, precise, unforgiving facts. And the first fact alone was enough to shake the entire self-defense claim. The wound trajectory. It didn't match a typical face-to-face struggle. It suggested distance and positioning, not a chaotic close-range fight, not a sudden accidental discharge during a physical struggle, but something far more controlled, something deliberate. And suddenly, the story told by the suspect started to weaken under its own weight, because self-defense requires immediacy, panic, reaction, a moment where survival overrides everything. But what the evidence was showing was control, not panic, not chaos, control. Meanwhile, the children were now in safe custody, away from the house, away from the crime scene, but not away from the memory of what they saw. And investigators knew something critical. Children don't always understand details, but they remember patterns, sounds, movements, moments. Especially the oldest daughter, the one who guided her siblings out, the one who saw more than she was able to fully explain. When forensic interviewers finally spoke with her, they didn't push, they didn't rush, they let her speak at her own pace. And what she described was not a chaotic struggle, not a long violent fight, but something brief, sudden, and deeply confusing. A moment, not a battle, a moment that ended too quickly for anyone to process. And that detail mattered, because it aligned more with the autopsy findings than with the suspect's story. Two independent sources, two different perspectives, both pointing away from self-defense. Back at the station, the pressure on the suspect increased. Detectives now had enough inconsistencies to challenge his version more aggressively. They returned to the timeline, minute by minute, second by second. Where was he standing? When did the argument start? When did the weapon appear? Who had control of it? But the answers remained unstable, shifting slightly each time, like sand being held too tightly. And detectives noticed something else. Every time the story reached the moment of the shooting, he slowed down, not emotionally, but narratively, as if approaching a rehearsed line, and then repeating it, almost identically. That repetition wasn't confidence, it was structure. And structure in a trauma narrative often signals preparation. Meanwhile, digital forensics began unlocking another layer of the case. The victim's phone. Messages were recovered, fragments of conversations, short exchanges that now carried heavier meaning in hindsight, because in those messages, there was tension, not explosive, but noticeable, a growing discomfort, a sense that something in the relationship had shifted. And then came the final messages, sent shortly before contact was lost. A message expressing frustration, a message suggesting urgency, and one final line that investigators would replay again and again. Something had changed in the house that evening, something that made her uneasy, something she was reacting to in real time. And then, silence. At exactly 6:55 in the evening, all communication stopped. That timestamp became critical, because it aligned almost perfectly with the estimated time of death, meaning whatever happened quickly and decisively. Back in interrogation, detectives now had enough to shift from listening to confronting. They began pointing out contradictions directly, not gently, not hypothetically, but clearly. The weapon ownership, the lack of struggle evidence, the forensic trajectory, the inconsistent timeline, the missing emotional response. Each point tightened the pressure, and for the first time, the suspect began to show strain, not panic, not confession, but irritation, defensiveness, shorter answers, longer pauses. The calm exterior was still there, but cracks were forming. Then came a critical moment. When asked again to describe the sequence of events, he hesitated longer than before, and repeated almost the exact same phrasing, word for word, as if retrieving it from memory rather than recalling experience. Detectives noticed immediately, because real memory evolves under stress, but rehearsed statements tend to remain rigid, and rigidity was becoming a pattern. Outside the interrogation room, the investigation was reaching a crossroads. Two narratives were now competing, one supported by forensic evidence, one supported by the suspect's account. But only one could survive full scrutiny, and investigators knew something important. Self-defense cases don't fall apart from one contradiction. They fall apart from accumulation, layer upon layer of inconsistency, until the story can no longer hold itself together. And this case was beginning to stack those layers, one after another, quietly, relentlessly. But the most powerful element of the entire investigation still hadn't been fully processed. The children's presence inside the home during the incident, because they were not just witnesses, they were silent anchors to the truth. And as investigators prepared to revisit every detail once more, one final realization began to form. If the suspect's version was correct, everything should align cleanly, but it didn't. Not the evidence, not the timeline, not the psychology, not the language, not the memory accounts. Nothing aligned perfectly. And in true crime investigations, that matters more than anything else. Because truth doesn't need adjustment. It doesn't need repetition. It doesn't need structure to stay stable. Only lies do. And as the interrogation moved toward its final phase, detectives were no longer asking if something was wrong with the story. They were asking how much of it had been constructed. By the time detectives reached the final stage of the interrogation, the room felt different. Not louder, not more chaotic, just heavier. Like the truth was finally close enough to touch. The suspect was asked one last time to explain what happened. And this time, there was no smooth flow, no rehearsed rhythm, just fragments, pauses that lasted too long, sentences that didn't finish cleanly, because the evidence had already taken control of the room. The autopsy didn't match his story. The timeline didn't align. The weapon ownership raised questions he couldn't explain away. And the children's account quietly destroyed the idea of a prolonged struggle. Every layer of his version was now under pressure. And pressure has a way of exposing what structure tries to hide. Then came the moment everything cracked. A simple question about sequence. He stopped, looked down, and repeated the same explanation again, almost mechanically, as if holding on to it was the only thing keeping him steady. But detectives had already seen enough, because innocent memory shifts, but constructed stories repeat. Outside the room, the reality of the case had already shifted. This was no longer about uncertainty. It was about how far the truth had been stretched before it broke. And what made it even more disturbing was how calm it all began. A normal evening, a burning pan on the stove, children inside the house, and a single moment that changed everything. No chaos before it, no warning signs in the final seconds, just silence, followed by irreversible consequence. And as investigators stepped back, one realization settled in. This case was never about what was said in the interrogation room. It was about what could not be explained away by it. Because in the end, the truth didn't need convincing. Only the story did.